All right, good morning, everybody. I appreciate all the early birds here who got here for the kickoff session of the day. We'll have probably more people shuffling in, so it may be a little disruptive for the first couple of minutes, but I know that they said that the session is full, so we've got a lot more seats to fill. We'll welcome them as they arrive. But it's a pleasure to have all of you here and be part of this conversation. My name is Chris Novak. I'm with Verizon. I lead our cybersecurity consulting practice and kind of want to talk about what I call kind of the cyber bodyguard notion. And really what that refers to is how do we protect our digital identity? Whether this is me, myself, or that of maybe senior executives in my organization, my board of directors. One of the trends that we've seen dramatically changing over the years has been the fact that more and more individuals are being targeted as it relates to cyber attacks. And I'll take you through a lot of data points that we see and kind of help build the picture of the problem, and then also as we go through talk about some of what we see as being kind of some of the solutions that everybody can kind of take home with them in terms of how to try to address this problem. We'll also have some time at the end for Q&A, so there are microphones in the middle, so as we get to that point, feel free to grab a mic and ask any questions that you may have, and I'll also try to spend some time outside afterwards as well if we run out of time. Always happy to connect. LinkedIn, Twitter, if folks want to continue the conversation that way as well, feel free to do so. And any and all parts of my presentation you're able to use and cite if there's anything there that you want, and I think everything is made available to you anyways. So feel free to use that as you see fit. So really the genesis of where this really starts is the notion that there is so much data already out there about all of us. And that information is being bought, sold, traded, used, misused in a number of different ways. And so I'm going to kind of take us through this and the usual disclaimer. The typical RSA disclaimer at the bottom is an added disclaimer. I do some board work for DHS, so just want to make clear none of this represents any DHS opinions or any policy opinions or anything like that. Want to get that out of the way. These are personal and Verizon points that I'll be talking about here today. So I wanted to set the stage, and I started here with the DBIR. How many people are familiar with the Verizon Data Breach Report? Okay, great. This is not going to be a DBIR presentation. I'm going to borrow a few data points from it to kind of help set the stage, but this is not a DBIR. I will say, though, for anyone who is interested in it, the 2023 will be coming out soon. And anybody who might want to get a sneak peek or early advance copy, please reach out to me and I will see what I can do. But I know I get that question all the time, is this a DBIR? And it is not. So hopefully we can kind of talk through where this data takes us. So over the course of the years, the key thing that we've really strived to do with things like the DBIR was to really have a data-driven, evidence-backed story. We wanted to be able to say, this is what the data shows us of how these events are actually occurring out there in the wild. What is it that a threat actor is doing to target a victim? How are they getting in? And one of the things that we've seen over the years has been that people have long been kind of a soft spot in that process. A lot of times when me and my team would go in and do breach investigations, we would often be asked, what kind of technology should the organization implement after they've recovered from the breach? What do they need to buy in order to make this not happen again? And obviously, I'm sure many of you know that the solution is rarely just buy more technology. In many cases, it is the people, process, and technology, kind of that three legs of the stool. And a lot of times what I find is organizations try to lean more heavily in one direction in order to make up for the challenges or difficulties in the others. So they'll say, well, you know what, the people thing is hard to solve, so let's spend twice as much on the technology, or let's go really heavy on the process. And as a result, we still have gaps, and we try to solve them in other ways. But in many cases, it's not entirely successful. And so that's really kind of what leads us to a lot of what we see here today. So in terms of attack targeting and how that continues to change, I highlighted here social engineering. This kind of shows you what the landscape of the breach trends look like over the course of the last several years. And so this is straight out of the last DBIR, where we look at kind of the rise and fall of different tactics that are used, or different ways in which victims are compromised. And you see I highlighted social engineering because obviously the nature of this conversation very much relates to the people part of the challenge that we face. And as I mentioned early on, there's so much information about us that it's almost become trivially easy for someone to target an individual if they so choose, because of the quantity of information that is out there. And I think, when we talk about social engineering, we often talk about training, user education, and awareness training. I think at this point, that is table stakes. Everybody needs to have that. If you don't have that, that's going to be probably your biggest gap. And just out of curiosity, raise your hands. How many people in the room have a user education and awareness training program at their company? Okay, I was expecting almost every hand to go up. Hopefully every hand goes up. And obviously, like I said, that's table stakes because we need to do that. But again, the challenge that we also face is that the attacks are becoming more targeted and more personalized. I'm sure you've all seen the nature of the landscape change around phishing and social engineering, even yourselves, where the messages become more crafted. I'll tell you, even just this morning, when I woke up in my hotel room, picked up my phone, like everybody else, first thing you do, check all your messages. And I see a message, I'm like, wow, this looks really interesting. And then I'm looking like, let me just check the headers. Check the headers, I'm like, it's total scam. But it looked so legit in every possible way. The graphics, the layout, they used my name. They even knew what thing to try to entice me with that would make me interested in looking at the message. But again, thankfully I didn't click through, I didn't give any information, but again, there's so much more information out there about us that it makes it easier to target us in these ways. And again, that's the reason why I mentioned the social engineering piece and the fact that it has begotten so much more targeted. And I would also say it's almost like the threat actors are, I don't know if this is fair to compare them to like advertisers, but if you think of the way marketing and advertising work, we're trying to target a demographic. And typically, how is the best advertising done? With big data. Right? I mean, think about all the various websites and places that you visit, the information that's gathered about you in order to be able to target you with an ad, right? And that's totally, we'll say legitimate, right? It's for legitimate purposes. But now as you browse the web, that item that you searched for on Amazon is now following you as you browse the web. All of that, again, is data about you coming together, using it to be able to target you for advertising. Now, consider the fact that threat actors and adversaries have all the same capabilities, right? They tap into a lot of that same data and then some. And keep in mind also that when we talk about the threat actors and the adversaries that are looking to do us harm, they're not looking to follow any of the rules either, right? We have different regulations, laws, and protocols around data privacy that the commercial community we engage with is supposed to follow, that limits our data exposure, or you have a right to your data being deleted, for example. But the threat actors obviously don't have to honor any of that. Right? They don't follow the rules. I tell people this all the time, that a lot of the breaches and things that we investigate, the challenges that we often face are that the defenders always have a set of rules and regulations that we need to follow, and sometimes it feels like we're kind of trying to fight a fight with one hand tied behind our back because we can't do this, we can't do this, we can't do this, we can't collect this data, we can't store this information, but yet we're expected to win these fights. And the threat actors don't have to abide by any of the rules because by nature they're basically criminals. So we'll continue on this kind of journey here. And you see here, the human is both a contributor and a target. And you see this giant 82% come out of the number. And this is straight out of the DBIR, talking about the role that the human element plays in the breach landscape. 82% of all the breaches that we saw tied back to the human element. Some role that a person played that resulted in that victim being compromised. And again, I mentioned that the user education and awareness piece being table stakes, but this is also why it's important that we are securing our people like we secure assets and data. Because at the end of the day, they essentially are that conduit into our systems. If we can get a person to make a mistake or to do something or to trip up or to click on something or download and execute something, that's the entry point for a lot of these threat actors into that environment. And so, important reason why we need to be looking at the people side of the equation. So, another thing I want to highlight here is we're often up against strangers. Most of the events that we see, most of the attacks that we see are external threat actors. They're not typically the insider or inside jobs. And you see there, that makes up about maybe 18 to almost 20% are insiders. But the large majority, the lion's share of the threat actors are external. They're people who don't know us. And the thing that I think is interesting about that is that it's both, I would say, kind of a disadvantage for both of us. And what I mean by that is, if you don't know who the adversary is coming at you, you have a hard time protecting and defending against it, right? If I can tell you this is the adversary, this is what they look like, these are the TTPs they're going to use, you'd have a relatively easy time stopping it, right? You put all the appropriate blocking and tackling in place, and they wouldn't be successful. But in pretty much every case that you're out there defending, you don't know what that next threat actor is going to be. You don't know what TTPs they're going to use. And the reason why I say this is interesting and kind of a disadvantage on both sides, but one that I would argue we can actually turn into an advantage for us. And what I mean by that is we don't know who they are, but at the same time, they don't necessarily know everything about us as well. And there is something we can actually do to make ourselves more, I don't know if I want to say invisible. And really a big piece of this conversation is how do we remove our digital footprints, our digital traces from the internet? How do we actually make it that much harder for them to ultimately be able to target this, right? Turn that disadvantage into some form of an advantage for us. So we see here that the attackers are largely motivated by money and influence. Pretty much every event that my team has ever investigated, it comes down to one of these two objectives. And ultimately, that is what drives a lot of their interest in targeting, whether it be businesses or individuals, right? When we target businesses, we see that ultimately they're going after things like, can they do a business email compromise? Can they fraudulently move money? Can they gain access to sensitive or valuable intellectual property? When they're targeting individuals, usually it's going after bank accounts, brokerage accounts, or maybe cryptocurrency wallets. But in many cases, it's around the financial piece. And then another big piece is around, like I said, influence. And that's typically more of what we see happen kind of on the espionage side of things. But what is interesting is when we look at, if you look at your own digital kind of footprints out there on the internet, I'm sure everybody here has probably Googled for themselves to see what information is out there about you. And that's just what you can see from a basic, internet search. There's obviously a tremendous amount out there that kind of what we say is kind of like below the surface, right? If you can Google for it, that's kind of above the surface. It's openly, easily available to everybody, but there's an entire market and economy of data that exists kind of below the surface that you can tap into and others can tap into, but it's not necessarily always easily searchable. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. And so this one is my attempt at a little bit of humor. And has anyone heard this quote before? Nobody? Come on, a couple of hands? All right. So I'll tell you, I wanted this in here, and I searched and searched the internet. I said, there has to be a meme for this. I could not find one. I had to create this. So I'm not sure how that happened, but I think everybody understands the challenge that we face here is, trying to get anything off the internet is incredibly challenging, incredibly difficult. And so I say it's kind of like getting pee out of a swimming pool. But I think the important piece here is, we need to take the steps necessary to actually start to scrub and sanitize what's out there. And so I'll kind of take you through a little bit more about that. And I want to be clear here on this one. I'm not trying to pick on OPM. There's a ton of these, and I'll show a snapshot of a bunch of different names in which we saw events happen. Talking about this purely because it is a public and an example of some of the impacts of it. But you see there, I don't know how many people here in the room either have or held a security clearance, but OPM is the organization within the U.S. government that manages the security clearance process, if you will, does the background checks and things like that. And so if you've ever had to go through that process, you provide a tremendous amount of information about yourself. And they obviously use that for purposes of figuring out whether or not you should get a clearance. And they suffered a fairly substantial breach that ultimately led to a lot of that background investigation and related information being exposed. And if you've ever gone through this process, they ask you everything, right? They want to know what was your teacher's name in 3rd grade, who are your neighbors, who is your cousin third removed. Like, it is really a very, very in-depth picture of who you are. And that data was all out there and exposed. And you can see the amount of time and effort that was taken, just one, to try to figure out what the extent of that exposure was, but then going another step further is, how do we actually go ahead and try to clean that up? Because the other thing that I always find challenging about data exposures that are tied to identity is that it's not changeable. For many years, I did a lot of investigations, and my team did a lot of investigations in the financial space, did a lot of big credit card breach investigations. And I don't want to say that those are easy. They're definitely not. But they're different in the sense that if your credit card data is stolen or compromised, your bank can issue you a new one, and it's almost like it never happened. If your social security number is compromised, if your background check data is compromised, nobody can say, well, fine. I mean, unless you enter witness protection, no one can just say, here's a new name, here's a new identity, here's a new social, here's a new background, you're now a new person. What everybody knows about you now is completely vanished, right? So that is also another challenge, is that you get to a certain point where some of this data, also when we get into things like biometrics, this data is data that is inherently you. And so once it's out there, kind of like my last slide, it's the pee in the swimming pool, it is really difficult to try to get that back or get that out. And then here's just the snapshot of all the other organizations, just in a quick search that I could find of kind of other similar ones like that we saw, where there's a lot or a large data exposure. And again, I'm not one to shame or blame the organizations. I say if you wait around long enough, everyone's going to experience some form of breach, and so someone's going to have some kind of data out there. And it all comes down to, what steps are we taking to mitigate and prevent that likelihood? What steps are we taking to reduce the impact and exposure when it happens? And how do we make sure that then we can ultimately recover from it when we see it? And then this here, just kind of an interesting point that I pulled from the Identity Theft Resource Center in terms of the number of breach events that occurred. So surprisingly, last year was a little bit lower. Now, I always say when we publish the DBIR every year, we always used to get a lot of questions on how many breaches were there and how many records were compromised. And in the early days of publishing that report, that was like a big headline news. In fact, one of the first reports we ever published, the cover of the report was, I want to say it was 285 million was the number of records that we had tracked as being compromised at that time. And it became almost like a barometer that people used to talk about, whether or not breaches are getting better or worse. And obviously, I don't like that, because I think ultimately there's so much ambiguity in what that data ultimately means. But the fact of the matter is, the amount of these events that are occurring every single day are only going to continue, are only going to get worse. And so the reason why we need to be focusing on what do we do to clean and scrub, our data and our digital footprint. So it's not just about the data breaches that can leak our data. There's also the notion of all the data brokers that exist out there. Just at kind of quick glance and talking with my team, we're tracking on about 600 data brokers. And now these are organizations that I would say maybe are legitimately in the business of exchanging information. And I say that kind of difficulty because some people would argue that maybe they shouldn't be or whatnot. That's a conversation and a debate for another session. But the fact of the matter is, they exist and they have a tremendous amount of data on lots of people, right? If there's just 600 of them in existence that I can just come up with this quickly, just imagine the size of the market that exists for buying and selling this data, right? And there's just a snapshot of a handful of them there on the bottom. The other thing that I also highlight is there is a lot of public records data that is out there. People are often surprised how much personal information about you is in public records documents. And interestingly enough, some of it you've never probably consented to. And if you search for it, you'll be shocked to find it. And again, it's not always easy to find. But there's also a lot of instances where this data is out there just because you clicked on one of those terms of service things where it's 400 pages long and you probably needed a lawyer to read it, and you click the checkbox, click submit, and so as a result you gained access to whatever it was. But as part of that, maybe it allowed that organization to then collect your data and use it for various purposes. And I see a lot of heads nodding in the room, so I know you've all seen this before. And so that is also yet another place in which your data is then being picked up, aggregated, and being used. The other thing also is every transaction that you've ever done. That is yet another place that creates a trail about your activity out there, whether it be financial information, if you have a mortgage, all of these things are or can be public records. Also, it's interesting, I don't know if anyone's ever got a background in like statistical analysis, or if anybody, I see a couple of hands, statistical analysis, running regressions on large data sets. It is wild what you can tell about somebody by only knowing a couple of data points about them. If you have a large enough data set, by just telling me a couple of things about you, I can probably build a pretty good picture of other things about you just based on the broader population. And so this is honestly a technique that a lot of advertisers use. And a lot of organizations will use to try to figure out how to pitch certain advertising to make it more focused at a specific audience, but also at the same time, threat actors can use that same kind of information to try to figure out, hey, if I'm going to target someone for financial gain, I probably want to target someone that looks like this or this or this kind of profile, because there's probably more there for me to take or steal. Or there's a higher probability that they have a cryptocurrency account, or a 401k that I can liquidate, or something like that. So they use a lot of these techniques in order to be able to determine what they might want to target. So hope is not lost. I think we can definitely take back our data. There's steps that we can do. And some of you may even be doing this, but I wanted to walk through a handful. I'll cover some right now, and then obviously there's more that we can look at as well. I'll touch a bit about browser privacy settings, social media privacy settings, data broker deletion, and then also it's important to be looking at things also. I'm not going to get into it for purposes of time, but also looking at the apps on your devices are also harvesting tremendous amounts of data. I'm not sure how many people have played around with any kind of tools like DuckDuckGo has an interesting VPN that you can install on your device. It runs locally, and what it does is it filters all the traffic that goes in and out of your mobile device, and it'll tell you all the apps on your device that are reaching out to various data brokers and how many times a day they are and which ones they're reaching out to. I would say if you haven't played with it, whether you decide you want to keep it and use it long term, it'd be an interesting experiment to try, because all these apps that you would think have no reason to be sharing your data with anyone, I bet you if you turn it on at the end of the session and you check it by the end of the day, you're going to see that the apps on your phone have probably communicated with 5,000 to 10,000 data brokers throughout the course of the day without you even using your phone. They're collecting data about what's happening on your phone, and that tells them a lot about you. And then there's also browser extensions, a whole host of other things as well. But I'll kind of jump into a little bit more of the weeds here. So on the browser privacy setting, one, looking at more privacy-focused browsers to begin with. The average user probably runs Chrome. Or maybe you're running something different on a Mac OS. Maybe I'm probably not using Safari as much, but a lot of people, I would say that's probably the big dominant browser is Chrome. The big dominant search is Google. Bing is moving up now with its relationship to ChatGPT, and that brings about a whole other set of complications as it relates to your data. But interestingly, all of those things contribute to the data harvesting, right? There's kind of an often said quote that, if you're not having to pay for the product, then you're the product. And in many of these cases, the tools that you're using, the applications you're installing, the websites you're visiting that are not making you pay, they're generally funding it through selling information about you to others, right? And a lot of people, when I talk with them about this, probably outside the context of an RSA, the average thing I hear from people is, I don't care. I'm just Google searching for something. What is anyone going to care of whether or not I want to know how to fix a 2007 Ford whatever, right? But again, it's all about building a picture. It's all about gathering more data, and if I gather enough data, I can fill in the blanks of the things that you didn't search for, and I can probably do it with fairly good accuracy. And in fact, we've done demos of this for people in the past. We used to do it at some of our conference booths, but it got to a point where we would start looking up things about people and we'd find things about them that they didn't want to be found. So we had to stop doing those demos. But again, there's a lot of information that's out there. And again, starting with the browser and the search, I would say is probably one of the first things you want to relook at. Brave is really good at that. Firefox has got a lot of great privacy controls. DuckDuckGo has a lot of commitments around privacy. If you're really uber concerned about privacy, there's also things like Tor browser, where it's not even just about limiting all of the JavaScript and other things that can happen in browser to collect data, but also it bounces the traffic all around the internet, such that it makes it even more difficult to just figure out where you are and who you are from a location or a geolocation of your IP address, et cetera. But I'd encourage you, whatever browsers you are using, check out the privacy settings on those, whenever you have a chance, because I bet you're probably going to be surprised at what you find. I actually looked up beforehand the European Data Privacy Board had talked about how often they believe that people just click through and accept all of the cookie, agreement type things. In fact, let me take a step back and say, a lot of people believe that those little banners that pop up on the bottom of every website where you say, I agree or I accept, that in some way that is preventing your data from being harvested and used. I think, hopefully, I see a lot of smiles in the room that people realize that's not the case. But there is a broad misconception out there. It's shocking, but there's a broad misconception out there that is somehow protecting you. The reality of it is that is giving them explicit consent to collect data and use it according to their terms and conditions. And there are a lot of people who thought, well, I'm going to assume in a place like RSA, most people probably go through and manually adjust all the cookie settings and say no to everything, or they go into their browser and they lock it down. So most of that started with GDPR. That really was a big push around a lot of this privacy-related item. The European Data Privacy Board estimated that it's somewhere between 60 and 90% of users just accept all cookies. 60 to 90% just accept all cookies. So it's almost like that little banner that you could say no to. It's almost like it's not there for most users on the internet because most people just click through. And it's amazing when I talk to people how often they'll say, but if I don't hit the big I agree button that's really quick and easy, then I have to hit the manage my selections. It takes me to another screen. I got to click a few boxes, and I just don't want to be bothered. So I just hit I agree. Again, nobody cares what I'm searching for. And so that is, I think, another challenge that we have to overcome, is that a lot of individuals, they're just not taking that step. And again, obviously, you're all here, so hopefully that's a shared interest that we all have in managing that. And then kind of the next step here is looking at the social media platforms and what can be done there. Because in these areas, this is interesting in the sense that you're generally regularly sharing things that are personal and obviously identifiable to you, right? They're in your profile, you're sharing them in your feed. And most people, again, have a similar type notion of, well, this is just being shared with my friends, my connections. And so as a result, I'm not really concerned. I'd tell these people this anyways. But the reality of it is there's lots of other places in which that data is being used, right? It's not just that your friends get to see it. It's not like you just shared this information with your next door neighbor talking through the fence. It's out there for many other people to see, for a lot of these social media platforms to be able to aggregate that data, use that information to then sell against that. And a lot of that, again, is where we see information going back into some of these data broker repositories that can then be used, again, for targeting in other ways. There's a lot that can be done to tighten up the privacy settings. I encourage folks to look within the app itself, but also there's a lot of these sites where sometimes the granularity of the privacy settings is not the same in the app as it is on the website version. So I always encourage folks to look at both of those, because sometimes you may find that there is more detailed granularity of the privacy settings you can change if you actually go through the website versus going through the mobile app. And then also consider looking at things like ad personalization. A lot of when we talk about privacy, it comes down to personal opinion, what is it that you all feel comfortable with? I'm sure if we surveyed the room of how you'd set up your privacy settings, we'd probably come back with a dozen or more different configurations of a particular app or a browser setting based on what you feel comfortable with. But for people who are really looking to lock it down, things like ad personalization, that's a big one. You know, some people like it because it means that you get more contextually appropriate ads. Some people don't like it because it means I'm sharing more information that allows me to be more I'd say accurately or definitively targeted. The other big one is location data. You know, this is also very interesting because if I can know when and where people are moving, I can use that information for other means as well. Think of it in the threat actor context. If I know when people are traveling or things like that, I can target them at those times. I mean, actually, you know, I'm going to step back one quick thing on this. The other thing also that I would mention is I'm not sure if what the breakdown of the room is as it relates to kind of Android versus iOS flavors. But one of the things also that is interesting is at least on the Android operating system, is it actually has an ability to remove permissions from apps that you haven't used in a while. So if you say, hey, I haven't used this app in 3 months, 6 months, it will actually go through and periodically find those apps that you haven't used in a while, and it'll actually suggest, or it can automatically remove their permissions. The idea being is, if you're not actively using the app, do you necessarily need it to have access to your files, your location data, your phone call records? You know, maybe it's something that you decided you're not going to use anymore. Maybe it's an app the developer has stopped maintaining. There's also, and I don't want to get too far abroad with this, but there's also situations where some apps that are, I'd say, more kind of smaller scale apps, we've also seen situations where the app will be purchased by someone else who doesn't necessarily maintain the same level of privacy controls or considerations. We've also seen the same things with browser extensions, which have the ability to watch and monitor every website you go to, the forms you fill out and things like that. If you're not familiar with those, definitely a good homework assignment to check out after the conference. But the apps and the browser extensions, I often kind of refer to them as zombies, is there's a lot of them out there that you probably have installed that you haven't used in a long time, but they still have access to your device, your data, your browsing. And we've seen situations where we've even seen like Russian threat actor organized crime groups that will buy up some of these to then gain access to everybody who's got them installed. So rather than me trying to get you to install a piece of malware, I will buy let's say a mediocre in terms of popularity browser extension or app. Whoever owns it is thrilled. They get a payday, their thing got sold. But in reality, that organized crime group is really just interested in the fact that they've already got an install base that gives them access into viewing people's browsing traffic and form entry, which might include things like payment information, PII, even credentials. So they don't have to even go through the process of actually trying to harvest the data. It's already been done for them. The other thing also is reviewing, friends, connections, follows, et cetera. Obviously, there's been a lot of turnover at Twitter and others recently that has really changed the landscape in terms of people understanding who they're connected to, what people are sharing. The other thing that is also challenging for a lot of people sometimes to understand is that a lot of times the data that you share out there, depending on the platform, you may set a certain control for what you anticipate that data to, how long you want it to live, how far reach you want it to have. But in some cases, you might actually find that some of those platforms, the control of that may actually be in the hands of others you've shared it with. They have the ability to screenshot it and share it further, or it may be subject to their privacy settings, or their friends and connections have the ability to see it. So sometimes that thing that you didn't anticipate to go all that far can go quite broad. And so I always encourage folks to look at that and see that those are real, necessary, genuine connections that you need. I mentioned kind of the pruning of connected and permitted apps in the sense of, what's on your device. The other thing I would also suggest you look at, because this is very frequently forgotten, how often do you go to a site and you say, I want to authenticate with Google, or I want to authenticate with Facebook or authenticate with Twitter. I see some people nodding yes, I see some people nodding no, which is a good mix. And then also there's a lot of apps out there now where there's a lot of integrated authentication. And a lot of times it serves a useful purpose. You want to share your Fitbit step data with your Strava or back and forth, or your Google Health or whatnot. And so you create all these integrations and connections between things. And while that in some cases makes life easy, in other cases that starts to again create these interconnections of where is my data and who has access to it. And so I always encourage people to look at that, because a lot of times when they go look in their Facebook or their Twitter or other places and they look to see all the connected and permitted apps, they're like, wow, I haven't used that in years. Or, if you go back to the early days of Facebook, if everyone remembers this, or maybe I'm just dating myself, but everyone used to go crazy taking all those quizzes. Do you remember those? You'd be like, there'd be some quiz that would pop up and it would tell you, take this quiz and we'll guess your favorite movie or whatnot. And obviously it was just fun people were having, but a lot of people are surprised to find that allowed those apps and those tools to maintain a connection to their profile and be able to continue monitoring them after they may have only done one of those little quizzes. So when you go back and look at that, you're going to see all these things in here that are years old. You're like, oh my God, that still has access to my profile information? I don't even know what that is, or I don't even want that there anymore. So again, an important thing to highlight there as it relates to what we see on the social media side of things. And what I encourage people to do is set a reminder to do this on a periodic basis, because a lot of times what I find is people kind of think of it as like a set it and forget it. They've done it once and they feel good about it, but as you go around doing your business, you're probably connecting to other things. In some cases you may want to, in other cases you may intend to remove it and you forget. So setting some kind of periodic reminder to come back and check on it, I think is also very important so that it doesn't get, stale and out of date. So when we talk about dealing with data brokers, this one is an interesting one because, believe it or not, you can purge that data. I will say it is probably some of the hardest pee to get out of the swimming pool, if I go back to my earlier meme, because for many of them, this is their business. They don't exactly want to make that easy. It is how they make their money. But most of them, if you actually look, they have a process for data removal, data deletion, but it is typically a tedious paperwork process. There's also services out there that will help you do that as well, and help with automating that. But ultimately, the only other way to do it is manual, is going out there, finding these sites, following what their processes are, and stepping through the removal of them. And be prepared for it to take time. Be prepared for them to sometimes have you jump through a few hoops, because they also will want to make that, like I said, difficult to get that data out there, data off of there. The other challenge that we also see on the data broker side is there's new ones entering the scene all the time. Some people feel that this is somewhat of a shady industry to operate in, so sometimes the policies that they have are maybe not always as transparent as we'd like. You may not necessarily always get straightforward answers to the requests that you make. You may think you've satisfied the paperwork, and they may say you forgot a checkbox. So there's a lot of things like that we see individuals run into challenges with. We also see a lot of kind of merger and acquisition in this industry, where data brokers will merge with others, and then you run into the issue of whose data privacy policies govern. Do you even know? In most cases, you probably don't have any idea which data brokers have data on you. So the fact that they are constantly moving, changing hands, or sharing data with each other, that adds a whole nother layer of complexity to it. And then obviously you have the legal and regulatory landscape. In some cases, this makes things easier for some parts of the world, right? There are certain places where you kind of have the right to be forgotten and deleted and things like that. But I would argue that is also not foolproof. If you look at a lot of the data brokers out there, they may have indications that they abide by all of these things, but that also assumes that they correctly know where everybody is and what the rules are actually that they have to follow. I've seen many circumstances where individuals have tried to remove their data, and the data broker says, well, but you don't live in this place. And they're like, I absolutely do, but the data broker has data that leads them to believe you live somewhere else. And so they believe that they don't actually have to remove your data. So there's a lot of ongoing battles and challenges like this. And then I have the chart there on the side to just kind of show you the the rapid increase in the data privacy, landscape that we see in terms of the number of laws that are out there on the books. And then I'm just going to wrap up with a couple of quick ways in which I think we can apply this as you leave here today, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So some stuff that you should look at. One, I think first is assessing what your digital footprint trail looks like. I just used one example here, the Have I Been Pawn site. There's other resources out there. This one is one that I've seen many people use and like, but it's an interesting one in terms of being able to just tell you if your information has been exposed in data breaches. I'd be shocked, given the amount of data breaches that have occurred, I'd be shocked if there's anybody in this room that if you go to that site, you don't find your information was exposed in a breach somewhere, right? You probably are gonna find it's several. So I'd encourage folks to check that out just as a way to get started and see what that looks like. And I think if anything, that should open your eyes to, okay, my data's out there. Now, what do I do next? What steps do I take? And it's also interesting because when you go through this, if there are sites that you don't use anymore, you might be able to prune some accounts and say, you know what, this site that was breached, I don't do business with them anymore. Maybe I close my account and I try to limit my exposure, or I look and change passwords in places, or I look to see, hey, if it is an organization that has a connection to my bank or something else, maybe I look at other things as well. So you kind of start to build a diagram or a map of maybe what your next steps would be after that. And then following on that, I'd say get into the privacy settings. This one, expect it's going to take time just as you figure it all out. Some of them, like I said, are more straightforward than others. I'd encourage you to try some of the more privacy-focused browsers. Some people find that it's a really easy transition. They really like it, and the peace of mind knowing that they're not continuing to create a bigger and broader digital footprint trail out there is a great peace of mind for them. Others sometimes find that, it creates, friction in places that they need to be able to operate more smoothly, and in some cases, maybe they maintain multiple profiles. For certain things, they use certain browsers, and certain things, they use others. So just kind of get into a motion to consider what that looks like and try them out. And then the next thing, which again is going to be probably more longer term, doing that data broker discovery and data deletion. I mentioned this is probably the most tedious thing out there to do and probably the most time consuming, just figuring out where it is and following the steps to remove it. I really tried to gear this more towards you all individually, but I want to ask you all, if you're part of an organization where you have cyber defense responsibilities, consider elevating this up a level and say, okay, what about others in my organization? Maybe it's not something you can do for the entire enterprise, but what is it that you're doing for the C-suite, the board, other VIPs who they may have a digital footprint out there that can create risk for your organization? At some point down the road, it's going to be a cyber attack or a social engineering campaign that's going to come at your organization or at your VIPs because their information is out there. And so this isn't just great for all of us as individuals, but I would challenge you all to apply it to your organizations to say, how do we make all of these other people more safe and more secure? Because that should hopefully make our day jobs of defending the enterprise much, much easier. And then obviously, don't pee in the pool. With that, I'll definitely transition to questions and see what questions folks have. Also, the Verizon booth in North Expo Hall at 5871. Feel free to drop by. We have folks from my team that'll be there talking about this topic and also some of what we do in terms of helping enterprises deal with, exactly that problem. How do we help people get, data out of places that they don't want it, scrub things that shouldn't be there for organizations, typically at the kind of more C-suite level, trying to protect the executives. So if there's questions, happy to take them. Please come to the microphones in the middle. I think we've probably got enough time for maybe 2 or 3 questions if folks have any.